Hi everyone, my name is Kara Alaimo. I'm an associate professor of communication at Fairleigh Dickinson University. I actually just started there, so this is my first NJCA conference and really happy to be here. Today I'm presenting my research entitled Speeches by US Governors Reveal that Women's Greater Legislative Success is Correlated with More Communal Approaches to Communication. So one of the things that I've been writing about for a long time for CNN Opinion is the experiences that women who run for office have. And just before the pandemic, this practically had me on the floor, but the UN did a study which found that 47% of people on Earth believe that men are better political leaders than women. And we can see this if we look at the number of women versus men serving in office all over the world. Hi everyone. We can also see this in the perception that women who run for office should somehow act like men. And if you read media coverage or look at questions they get in debates or look at the commentary of political opinion leaders, there's this sense that women should somehow conform to the expectations for men if they want to be elected to office. And I'm actually a political scientist by training, and so I started by looking at the political science literature before I moved into the communication literature on this. And what I found is that there's actually a growing body of evidence which finds that once in office, women significantly outperform their male counterparts. Studies have found that women politicians are more likely than male politicians to get their legislative proposals passed, which is something that I'll be talking about in a moment. On average, women who serve in the US Congress get 9% more money earmarked for their districts than male members of Congress. There's a literature about how women politicians tend to cooperate more, and sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes that's a bad thing, depending on whether they're in the minority or the majority party. But in particular, when they're in the minority party and compromise is needed in order to advance their legislative proposals, women are able to advance their legislative proposals through greater stages of the legislative process. Another study found that women who serve in state legislatures respond to requests from their constituents more than do men in state legislatures. And you may have heard talk about this, but particularly during the pandemic, we know that countries that were led by women had half as many pandemic-related deaths as did those led by men. We also find that in peace processes, in countries that experience conflict, when women are involved, a peace negotiation is much more likely to hold. So all of this really sort of at odds with this perception that women aren't as strong when they serve in political office. So I'm not sure if you've ever read Carol Gilligan or any of the literature that comes out of women's studies and gender studies. But one of the things that Carol Gilligan talks about is how girls and boys are socialized really from birth in our society, right? So boys are socialized to be more competitive, girls are socialized to be more cooperative and more relational. And so one of the things that I hypothesized was that we would see these behaviors in the communications of politicians and that this might affect their efficacy. Because when I think about the ways that girls and women are socialized to behave in our society, to think about the feelings of others and to cooperate and to find consensus and to get along, it struck me that those are traits that might actually be incredibly valuable and effective in political leaders. So, starting with that hypothesis, there's two political scientists, Thad Kouser and Justin Phillips, who conducted one of the largest, most detailed studies that was ever done that looked at the efficacy of governors in the United States. It was a huge study. They looked at 1,088 policy proposals that were made by governors in their State of the State addresses, and then they looked at whether those governors were able to deliver on the promises and pass that proposed legislation into law. One of the things that struck me was that no gender analysis was ever done of this work. And so I wrote to them, and they very generously shared their data, and I analyzed it based on gender. So I looked at the rate at which the policy proposals of male governors were passed and the rate at which the policy proposals of women governors were passed. And what I found was that women governors were able to implement their policy proposals at over 1.2 times the rate of their male counterparts. So here's where their communications come into play. As you know, I hypothesized that we'd be able to see in their communications that these women politicians are behaving in stereotypically feminine ways, and that would affect their efficacy. And so there were 4 women governors who served at the time of this study that I looked at. And what was really useful from a research perspective was that the original study was done in 2001 and in 2006. None of these women were in office in both years. So that means that all 4 of the women had a male counterpart in the same state during this time period that I could compare them to. So that's what I did. So I looked at all 4 women governors, and then I studied the 4 male governors who served in those same states, either in 2001 or in 2006. And what we did is I had a student helping me, and we coded their State of the State addresses, just kind of the equivalent in a state of the State of the Union address that the President of the United States gives. In total, this is a laborious process. In total, we coded 85,244 words delivered by women governors in their State of the State speeches, and 88,945 words delivered by men in their speeches, which reflects 5 State of the State addresses for each of the 8 governors who we analyzed. And here's what we found. Women governors use the word we at a rate of 0.018. Male governors use the word we at a rate of 0.016, which is a difference that's statistically significant. Whereas women governors were more likely to use this communal language and the use of the word we. Male governors were more likely to use more individualistic language. They used the word I at a rate of 0.011, whereas women governors used it at a rate of 0.010, but because the data set is so large, this is a difference that does become statistically significant. The other thing that really struck out at me was the difference in the way the male and female governors talked about cooperation. So male governors discussed cooperation 52 times in 20 speeches for a rate of 2.6. Women governors discussed cooperation at almost 1.5 times the rate of their male counterparts. So what does this say to me? It says, obviously, I don't want to confuse correlation and causation. I can't prove causation in this study. What it says to me is that the more communal approach that women took, using the word we, talking about cooperation, was associated with greater efficacy when they were in office. As we know, these women governors were more likely to have their legislative proposals passed into law. And so I'd really love to see a lot more research that digs into this and begins to explore whether there is a causal relationship here. But if this were to hold up across more studies, it suggests that politicians of all genders might be more effective if they communicated in this more communal way that girls in our society are socialized to communicate. And I think, ultimately what it says is that, to think back to, my first slide, that voters are just incorrect in this assumption that women are not strong politicians. I would say I did a second study to try to replicate these results in a different context. I actually presented that yesterday at Seton Hall's conference on women and gender. Found the same results. In that study, I looked at women and male governors during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. Looked at all 50 states, and what I found was that in states led by women governors, this involved a huge analysis of CDC and Bureau of Labor Statistics data, but basically what I found is in states led by women governors, there were fewer numbers of excess deaths related to COVID-19 as reported by the CDC, and there were also lower unemployment rates. And that finding was really interesting to me because during the pandemic, as we all know, there was often a huge debate that presented things as a trade-off. Either we reopen our economies and take a risk with our health, in order to promote employment, or we protect lives at the expense of jobs and people being able to feed their children, right? Like that was the trade-off that was often discussed. My research actually found there was no such trade-off. In states led by women, there were both lower numbers of deaths and lower unemployment rates. And then again, I looked at the why, looking at their communications. I coded tweets by male and female governors, and again, used slightly different measures, but all of this sort of same results ultimately held up. So I really welcome feedback on this as I try to move this towards publication. I've been toying with the idea of combining both studies into a single journal article, just to sort of provide more data to back up my hypothesis and my findings. This I submitted to Women's Studies and Communication and got a rejection saying I didn't include enough intersectional feminist literature in my literature review, so they wouldn't consider it for the journal. So trying to figure out next steps and would really very much welcome feedback. So thank you. Any questions for me or comments? Yes.
Very interesting study. Do you account for political affiliation in the two groups between Democrat or Republican?
I didn't.
Wouldn't that be important in the way we talk?
Yeah.
Each party talks? Yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to keep it nonpartisan, but I'm wondering if you think this is the.
Well, how many of the 4 women versus 4 men were Republican or Democrat? I guess that would matter, I think.
Yes,
Yeah.
I need actually to pull my paper to
Yeah.
look that up. I don't remember. We coded this like a year ago.
I think that would matter, yeah.
Yeah, I certainly know because I was more recently coding the tweets that it was absolutely the case. So in my tweets, for instance, in the second study, I was coding tweets by Kristi Noem, and she talked like the male governors, right? And so I was trying to stay away from like a partisan finding, but I'm wondering if this is the.
Was it equal representation or when the breakout of the two groups?
Yes, so with the second study,
Okay.
I purposely selected, with my second study, there were only 3 Republican women governors, and because I wanted to have an equal number, I did a random sample of 3 Democratic women.
Okay.
With this study, I need to go back to the paper and I could tell you in a minute. In fact, it's on my desktop. But yeah, I'm wondering if this is the concern I'm gonna get from reviewers and if I should just go back and add it now.
It's just a point, yeah.
Yeah.
To think about, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid one. It's the first thing someone said in my presentation yesterday too, so.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Very interesting.
Any other questions or ideas? Yes.
Were there any other forms of social media that you touched on, or was it mainly Twitter for the research?
So I wanted to, so in this study, the study that I presented today, I only coded state of the state addresses, and that's because there's this one incredible data set that no one's ever been able to replicate just because it was so labor intensive to like look at these 1,088 policy proposals and actually follow through the news in all of these states about what happened later, right? So this data set was from the years 2001 and 2006 before Twitter Twitter started in 2007, right? So so here I coded their state of the state addresses, which you wouldn't believe were harder to get your hands on than you would imagine. I imagined I'd just go online and download their state of the state addresses, right? No, I had a student who was actually like writing to state archives to get these governors' state of the state addresses. So I purposely didn't want it to only be social media because, as we know with social media, particularly today, a lot of politicians have social media managers and they should be channeling the voices of their bosses, but they do to varying extents. And so I felt like with the state of the state address, that's something that the executive may not have written the first draft themselves, but that's something they really had their hands on and stood up and delivered and would have carefully workshopped to reflect their voice and their beliefs. Tweets are what's available readily right now, right? Like they're such a great data source, but I felt like there was the possibility that they would be a little bit more removed from, like people were asking me yesterday in my presentation, well, like what about their staff members, which would also be like really interesting, I think, to study as well. And again, because like I want to look at this from a bunch of different angles, right, and then see if I'm consistently finding the same results. So it did state of the states, did tweets. I'd kind of be interested to find another data source that I could look at as well. press conferences or
Press
something like
releases
that.
or, yeah.
Yeah, but I feel like, do you feel like press releases are even less likely to be written
I
by the
like,
principal?
I like the concept that you did the state of the state, because it's formal speech versus the informal, and not all politicians have staff controlling their social media, they're posting it themselves. So it's really informal.
Right.
And it's just what's on their mind instantly versus a structured formal agenda.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, it's a much more considered way of,
Yeah.
you know, presenting themselves. What stinks is that like I will never get my hands on data like this probably ever again, right? And so now I've got to figure out, okay, well, you know, how else can I get really valuable data sets? And there were only 4 women governors during this time, right? Even now we've got more women in office, but I just have less access to a data set like this. I mean, I can study their state of the states for sure, but without being able to, you know, match it to policy proposals, I need other ways to measure their efficacy, which is why I was looking at like unemployment and deaths and things like that in their states. Yes.
So you said you only, like the form of social media you looked at was Twitter, correct?
So for this study, I analyzed state of the state addresses, but then yes, Twitter.
Okay. Would you ever consider, I mean, I know Twitter's the primary form of social media generally used by politicians. Would you ever consider looking at like Instagram?
I could, but like, I could be wrong. I'm doubting that a lot of these male politicians are on Instagram.
Yeah.
I could be wrong. Like, it'd be interesting to see what happens, particularly with everything that's happening at Twitter right now, right? Like, are people gonna migrate to other social
Yeah.
networks, right? For me, like Twitter was the place where I wanted to analyze 300 tweets by each governor, and there were a few that didn't quite tweet 300 times in the year, but were pretty close, like in the high 2s. And so it was kind of like a decent data set.
Yeah, it was consistent.
But yeah, like as people evolve to other platforms, I think the more mediums I could study this in, the better, for sure. I also feel like Instagram is so visual that often you don't, like sadly, like
Yeah, it's
you
visual,
probably,
yeah.
you probably have a more thought out political statement in, you know, in your 2 or 3 sentences on Twitter sometimes, right? Like, and so that would, you know, also Instagram would involve more interpretation on my part if I were evaluating images, right? Text seems like a little bit more objective. Right. Anyone else? All right, thank you so much.